Welcome back, everyone. This week, we're going to be reading Charlotte Perkin Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, as well as some documents that are related to the story, and we'll call those documents secondary sources. Um, Now, I want us to begin thinking about how fiction can be used for purposes of social critique. That is, how fiction can be used to raise awareness about and ultimately protest social ideas, practices, or institutions that the author thinks is unfair. Here's a little bit of information about the publication of The Yellow Wallpaper. The story was first published in January of 1892 in the New England Magazine, and then it was reprinted in 1920 in The Great Modern American Stories, but it was reprinted as a horror story. So we're going to get to why in just a minute. I want to give you a little bit of background information on Charlotte Perkin Gilman. Her dates are 1860 to 1935. Gilman was a prolific writer and editor and also a keen social activist. She was strongly interested in women's rights, in particular, the way in which economic structures can negatively impact women's lives. And her most famous nonfiction work is actually called Women in Economics. It's a treatise that argues that, and this is a quote, women's position in society is directly related to economic factors most often determined by men, end quote. In other words, she argues that men hold economic power over women and that women's economic disempowerment relates to the fact that they live in a culture where they have less access to education than men do, where they can't earn as much money as men, and where they're expected to provide unpaid domestic labor as wives and mothers. And this gender power structure is definitely explored in The Yellow Wallpaper. So here's some more background on The Yellow Wallpaper. The story details the experience of a woman who's been ordered to bed rest by her husband slash physician. And as part of this treatment, she is deprived of company, of reading and writing materials, and she becomes obsessed with the wallpaper in the room. And the story follows this woman's essentially sort of descent into psychosis. She begins to lose touch with reality, which is manifest in the fact that she believes that there's a woman behind the wallpaper. This story is actually based on Gilman's own experience with mental health treatment following the birth of her daughter. And here's what happened. Essentially, shortly after the birth of her daughter, she became very depressed with what we assume was probably postpartum depression. She sought treatment from her depression from a doctor named Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, who diagnosed her with something called neurasthenia or nerve exhaustion. Now, Mitchell had helped to define the diagnosis of nerve exhaustion in a book that he'd written and published in 1871. So he was a very well-known mental health practitioner. In that book, he argued that American life was lived at just too fast a pace because of increased urbanization and technological changes. And this fast pace, he argues, basically fatigued the nerves of some people. In other words, he argues that the disease was a consequence of modern American life. I can't imagine what he would say about modern American life today. Now, the symptoms that he ascribes to this nerve exhaustion are really vague and general. They're things like fatigue, weight loss, depression or anxiety, insomnia, and lethargy. And while he felt that both men and women could get this disease, he felt that women were particularly susceptible. And he thought that women could develop this condition when they were too active outside of the home. Either when they were out working, when they were, sort of participating in public life, or when they were basically doing anything other than fulfilling their traditional role as wives and mothers. So essentially, he diagnosed this disease as essentially a disease that could come about once women were no longer interested in their traditional gender roles. So there's a way in which his diagnosis reflects his own anxieties about changing roles of women in society. And not surprisingly, his treatment sought to restore women back to their traditional gender roles. So, what he encouraged was for women to engage in what was called a rest cure, which sounds remarkably similar to what the heroine in the yellow wallpaper goes through. It included bed rest for several weeks, in which the patient was not allowed any reading or writing materials or even conversation. The patient also wasn't allowed to move. Instead, the patient was given massages to stop their muscles from atrophying, and they were spoon fed milk and soup. Now, Dr. Mitchell put Gilman on this rest cure. She did it actually for a few weeks. And then he sent her home with follow up instructions to engage in domestic activities, in particular, to really throw herself into her role as a mother, and then to avoid all writing and sort of intellectual activities for the rest of her life. And Gilman felt that the experience was really dangerous to her health. And she actually described it as one in which she, quote, came perilously close to losing my mind. And so her story reflects both her own views about the rest cure and really the way in which this cure can make women go crazy. But it also reflects her feelings about the unfairness of late 19th century gender norms, including the way in which ideas about gender were written into the way in which women were diagnosed and treated by the medical community. And there's a long-standing history within medicine of associating women's health with certain types of mental health conditions, in particular things like nervousness and like hysteria, which is sort of a heightened state of anxiety. These were thought to be conditions that women traditionally were more susceptible to. So if you think about this story, it definitely starts to explore sort of the kind of medicalization of ideas about gender, because the heroine's husband is a physician, and he begins the story by saying that he knows what's best for her, and he prescribes her as having a nervous condition, which is a very kind of typical diagnosis that one might find in the 19th century for women, that that she was just sort of super nervous or super anxious. And then as part of his treatment, he basically infantilizes her. That means that he treats her like a baby by asking her to stay in bed, to not look at any reading or writing materials. And then he also puts her in a room that she thinks was probably a nursery. And the question that the book raises is kind of, when is this heroine most crazy? Is it at the end of the book when she's ripping the wallpaper off the walls? Or is it at the beginning of the book where she kind of passively accepts her husband's diagnosis and she ardently believes that he's going to make her well? All right, I look forward to talking about this and other questions with you on the discussion board. Please let me know if you have any questions.